All right, good evening, everybody out there in YouTube land. Now that I'm not so scatterbrained with everything else taken care of, where I was during my earlier videos. Yeah. So, anyhow, let's get into it. So, I want to talk about the comparison and compare and contrast between a system like socialism. Might as well call socialism and communism almost the same. One's just more an extreme version of it in capitalism. And the pros and cons of each and why we should have a yin-yang approach. You know, a yin-yang approach would actually be perfect. And like in a utopian society. Now, obviously, too much socialism is a bad thing. And again, when you start bailing people out, it just leads to more consumerism and consumers getting into debt that they can't pay off. And this is going to tie into, the whole student loan forgiveness. And why that might, have its drawbacks. Because, as of now, student loans are a debt that you incur because we have to pay to go to college here in the U.S. This is U.S. based. Now, other countries, they probably, I imagine, have more of a socialized, education system. And correct me if I'm wrong, if you're not from the U.S. and you want to comment on that and correct me, feel free. But if I'm not mistaken, if they have a socialized education system like that, up to a certain point, and in this case, a bachelor's degree, that's a common example right there. Anything higher than that or specialized, obviously you got to fork over the cash. Hopefully in those countries, there's not too much fucking cash. Anyhow, that's not the case here in the U.S. Here in the U.S., the school systems, K through 12 are all but socialized. Everybody pays into that. Even if you don't have kids in school. People who are self-employed, they pay into things like, unemployment. And it's been that way, even though they may never benefit from it. But there's other things where, there's a socialist, ideology behind it. And, it's not directly socialism. It's just, that's just the way it is. Roadways. If you really want to go the extreme capitalist route, somebody who's never been to California is going to say, well, why should my tax dollars go into California? And hell, even in California, somebody who lives in like LA may never ever use a road that takes them up north. And they'll be like, why should we pay for that? You see where I'm going with this. I live in Virginia. I pay state taxes and federal income tax. And obviously, those tax dollars go to, parkways, roadways. I'm not going to fucking use a fucking roadway in Virginia, But it's like if everything got boiled down to, each county, or hell, even each town or city, then you probably get some roadways that are nice and some that are just so filled with fucking potholes you need a fucking monster truck just to get through. And, if you've seen some of my other videos, where I took the Santa Cruz on a Jeep trail, don't ever do that big mistake. Some roads might actually look something like that. If we were to go total full capitalist. And here in the U.S., obviously, medical care is another one that I think should also be included in that. But let me talk about student loan first and college first. The problem with the capitalist society, with that is, again, seeing all these videos with student loan debts, people crying. I mean, I have student loan debt myself, and unless the shit really, really, really were to go fucking south, I've always been under the school of thought, you borrow money, you pay your debts, or you suffer the consequences. And that's just the way it is. Same thing with a car note. Now, I don't think half these conversations would be happening if we had a socialist education system up to bachelor's degree. And in today's world, a bachelor's degree may be basically the new high school diploma when you really stop and think about it. Because there are companies, and this might be another video in of itself, that will actually put on their posting, has to have a bachelor's degree, even if it has nothing to do with the job itself. I saw one, comedian, who did a joke where, she works full time in like an administrative office of some sort, doing like office shit. And obviously the joke was getting into a pissing contest with another coworker, in the same department. And, the coworker's like, I got a degree in business administration. And the comedian responds, well, I have a degree in art, and we have the same job. So in that aspect, the degree actually doesn't pertain to the job. Because I'm guessing the company side said, must have a bachelor's degree. And, there's some ethical questions, to that as well. But again, that's a whole other topic in of itself. But, we have privatized higher education system. We have privatized medical system, which as well as I do, people have gone back and forth on that. And we all know what happens with the problems of a privatized healthcare system. And how we're the only developed nation that people have to set up GoFundMes for medical care. That shit ain't right. And, like I said, a yin-yang approach, to society would probably be beneficial all around. Because, like I said, there's going to be certain things our tax dollars go to that we don't get any benefit from. But our tax dollars go into it. And obviously one of them is, roadways. Parks, people like to go visit parks all the time, and K through 12. Like, I don't have kids. I've never married and had kids, but some of my tax dollars go into, in this case, Fairfax County school systems, even though I don't have any kids there, All of my siblings are adults. They work. They pay taxes into it. I mean, I suppose the difference between that is, we also went through the school system. This was up in Massachusetts, by the way. We all went through the same school system at some point. But, even so, we still pay into it. And, again, I'm not going to get into, express lane fees, but that's a whole other topic in of itself. But anyhow, in my honest opinion, certain things should be universal all around. Because if we didn't, people wouldn't be able to tour different states. They wouldn't be able to go visit their family, who lives in another state. Like, I live in Virginia. I would not be able to drive to Massachusetts and visit family. Like, I'm not sure which family houses are safe zones based on who voted for who, but that's a whole other animal in itself. But yeah, again, like I've said before, two things, that would have made America, much better. We wouldn't have this fucking pissing contest, people trying to flee the U.S., all that crap. Would have been higher education up to a point past high school, and that could be, again, college for a bachelor's degree, trade schools, because those cost money too. And now, a lot of the so-called for-profit schools, they offer trade programs, but they're also just as much as a fucking traditional brick and mortar so-and-so college. You know what I'm saying? And, so again, K through 12 and, state schools, I think the fucking private schools, unpopular opinion, but I think they should just do away with private schools altogether. Unless it's for a specific training. Get rid of all the useless degrees, gender studies and 14th century lesbian, bird dancing and basket weaving. Get rid of all those useless degrees. I think, like I said in a previous video, I think it was either Wisconsin or Wyoming that was trying to ban colleges, or maybe they succeeded banning colleges from offering the useless degrees that ain't going to do shit, that you really don't need to pursue a career in that field. So yeah, get rid of all that, and maybe you wouldn't see so many angry people being in debt. And obviously, make things a little bit more affordable. I'm having a hard time grasping, on each, the expensive things, here in the U.S. But again, that's a whole nother topic in of itself. Now, obviously, in a pure capitalist society, you're going to have your classes of people. It's going to basically be like a fucking MLM scheme. Yeah, I got this business opportunity. I think you should check it out, man. You can make lots of money, man. When your friends call you, when they want to make money, they want you to help them make money. They don't call you just to fucking hang out and shoot the shit. I've had that happen plenty of times. And again, I've known people who've gotten into that, and I think there were a few that actually made some success with it. Now, it might not have been the big time billionaires that did it, but it made enough success to where they could quit their job. So, okay, hooray for them. But obviously, in a pure capitalist society, you'll get classes, and I think India might be a good example of that, based on some of the stuff I've seen about India. How you have, you're super uber wealthy over there. Then you have, you what they call middle class. I don't know where the cutoff is, and then obviously, the poor people, who live in slums, in the fucking jungles, much like that one guy who fled the U.S. to not pay student loans. And and they're eating rats. And we may be heading that way. We would probably head that way in a purely capitalist society, because the people at the bottom of the barrel, such as your retail workers, your food service workers, they don't make enough to be able to afford to eat. This was actually documented in Walmart High Cost Low Price, a very old documentary. I think you should check that one out. Type it in YouTube, you'll find it. It's fucking easy to find. But Walmart's a whole nother topic in of itself. While I've said that in some cases where the company requires one, and it was a good job. Let's assume it was a good job, and those have floated around in the distant past. At the time, I didn't have one, but they floated around in the distant past, and they were good jobs. Good paying jobs, paid a lot more than fucking food service and retail. Even if the degree had nothing to do with what you went to school for, because much like when company loyalty meant something, having that piece of paper basically told that company that you're willing to stick through something. But now I think, I swear, I think since the late 2000s, early 2010s, it's been getting really, 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 really bad. Where where almost like the reverse is true. The cost of education's gone up. The cost of a state school when I was going, in state was practically as much as going to a private school in 1994, 95. Let that shit sink in. Where is the justification for that? If I went to fucking, Tufts University, Yale, some big out-of-state university where I didn't have in-state residents, insert big league school of your choice. I'd have probably fucking 4 times the student loan debt that I have. At least 3. No, at least 2. At least 2 times. Possibly 3. Based on the cost of schools. And I've done videos on this. Like, where is the justification in charging fucking $50,000 a year? Just to fucking go somewhere. And and that's a whole nother subject in of itself. And a lot of people who are successful, and I've referenced them in some of my other videos, they either never went to college, worked in the trades, or they became an entrepreneur in some other way and made money that way and became successful, and that's fine. And like I said in a previous video, if it wasn't for people in the trades, people who wanted to go to college would have college to go to in the first place. Because somebody had to be out there laying those bricks, wiring up all the electrical components, doing all the plumbing, doing all the masonry, doing all the landscape, all that shit that required into making a campus a beautiful campus for all the college kids to be happy. And all the brochures showing happy, happy college students. I'm so happy. I'm enjoying that college experience, I know I'm entitled to poke fun at college students because I was one. So I know I went later in life, but that's neither here nor there. So again, a purely capitalist and a purely socialist society, aka communist, they're gonna have a lot of the same downfalls in different ways. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'll talk to you.